Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In today's first segment, we're going to discuss Syria. Now, Donald Trump made a statement which I imagine has gone viral around the world about saying that let someone else fight over this long, blood-stained sand. Referring again to Syria, but I imagine that could really stretch to the entire Middle East. Now, Trump claims that he wants to leave all military interventions around the world, especially in the Middle East, saying that the region's people should be resolving their own issues. But is he really leaving? Because we now have reports that, in fact, oil fields will be, quote unquote, protected by U.S. forces in Syria. Not really leaving the region at all, is he? And then on top of that, we have the German defense minister talking about an international safe zone in Syria. Why should the international community be getting involved again in a sovereign country? Is their involvement welcome at this time? The German defense minister has spoken about a safe zone which would include UN troops and would work under a UN mandate as well. Those, of course, are important details, certainly. This, we know, comes in the wake of the fact that we've had this deal between the U.S. and Turkey, as well as Russia and Turkey, over that safe zone in Syria, over Turkey's concerns about its border security. And of course, that's another whole argument, but certainly it's important to discuss if there's really a place right now for international organizations and international coalition to get involved at this time. Let's discuss this a bit further. Firstly, we're joined by Taleb Ibrahim, who's a political analyst. He's joining us now from Damascus. Taleb, thank you for joining us here in Scope. Taleb, what do you make of Donald Trump's claim that he does not want his forces to continue fighting over this long, blood-stained sand, talking about Syria?
Yes, I think this is a very well-known policy of Donald Trump, who does not want to be involved in any more wars in Middle East or in any part of the world. And you know that the man has a real tendency to provide economic pressure and political pressure instead of direct military intervention. And this is a very good thing for the Middle East, a very good thing for the nation of the Middle East. And I think United States now is unable to intervene by military means in Middle East, especially after their war in Iraq, which they couldn't make any change, and they lost trillions of dollars, and in Afghanistan also, and in other parts of the Middle East. What I want to say is that for our people who are living in Syria and in Middle East, this is very good news to see American withdrawal from Syria. But let me say something, that American intervention didn't bring democracy or freedom to Middle East. It brought Al-Qaeda, it brought extremism, and it brought civil war to the region.
But Taleb, he's not really leaving Syria at all, because he still has forces. The Pentagon has requested forces to protect Syrian oil.
Yes, they want to put their hands on oil resources in Syria, not only oil resources. There are a great reserve of gas in Syria. Some people estimate that this is one of the greatest gas reserves in the world. Other issue which is very much important, that in the Syrian desert we have a great amount of silicon, which is a vital element in the modern technology and modern industries. Moreover, we have a lot of lithium salts in the salt mines nearby Derzor. I think that American discovered that, and they are trying to put their hands on all of the Syrian treasures. This is very bad news, but I don't think that it's realistic for the United States to stay for a very long time in Syria, especially in the oil fields. Why? Because Syrian army became very, very close to those oil fields, and Kurds, who are the main allies of United States, they do not trust the United States, and they will not work anymore with them. So American military existence in Syria will face many obstacles and many problems, and I think by the end of the day, they should be withdrawn from Syria.
Okay, so, also a proposal now, Taleb, by the German defense minister, who has called for a safe zone to be set up in Syria, but this time by an international coalition, not just, for example, Turkey, Russia, or even the U.S., but for this to be done with an international coalition under a UN mandate as well. Do you think that that is necessary at this time?
No, I don't think this is necessary, and we do not need any safe zone in the north of Syria. And the German proposal is not realistic. Why it is not realistic? Because Syrian government will not agree to that. The Syrian legitimate government, which is represented by the United Nations, and the Russian are very much skeptic and hesitated about that. And I don't think that they will agree to do that. Especially they are the closest ally to the Syrian government, and I will tell you something that there's a daily and permanent contact between President Bashar Assad and President Vladimir Putin, and Russia will not do anything which is refused by Syrian government. Moreover, I don't think Turkey will be very much happy to see United Nations forces and its borders to the south. Why? Because they believe that this will provide a safe resort to the Kurdish terrorists, between brackets, who are undermining the Turkish national security from the perspective of Turkey. So I don't think this is a realistic proposal, and this is not a realistic idea. By the end of the day, I think it is a Syrian and Turkish matter, and we have the agreement of Adana between Syria and between Turkey in 1998, in which two countries made an agreement to keep security and safety in the borders and to cooperate in the matters of economy, politics, and especially security. Okay. So I don't think this is a realistic idea.
Very well. Let's add another voice to this conversation. Also now joined by Joseph M. Siracusa, who is Professor of Human Security and International Diplomacy. He's also President of Australia's Council for Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. He's joining us now on the line from Melbourne. Joseph, as always, thank you for your time. What do you make, Joseph, of Donald Trump's pledge to get out of Syria? He used the language of blood-stained sands, but then at the same time, he wants to protect, quote unquote, oil fields in Syria.
Yeah, I'd say there was some confusion on the president's part. Look, our last two presidents have been elected to get out of the Middle East. We're talking about Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Syria in the last couple of years. And so the president's looking for the off-ramp. He had this wonderful discussion with President Erdogan, and he saw this opportunity to remove these troops from this policing duty up on the border. The only trouble is he didn't tell anybody else. He just informed his own people that he was doing this. There was a great deal of confusion and cross-signaling. Yeah. And in many ways, the president's response to these things are unfettered. It's unfiltered. If he'd have talked to someone else, like General Mattis in the old days, a couple of years ago, he would have got a different response. But there's a great deal of confused signaling, though the president, he's true to his own constituency. They want to get out of that part of the Middle East. The trouble is that the president didn't give anybody any warning. So it was a poorly executed decision to do something. And now he's backtracking by saying he's going to protect the oil. So it doesn't make any sense to a lot of people. But don't imagine we have to make sense of it. It just doesn't make any sense. So I guess that's the takeaway.
Okay, let's add another voice to this conversation as well. We're also with Noufal Abboud, who is Executive Director of the Nordic Center for Conflict Transformation. He's also a researcher of peacebuilding and transitional justice processes. He's joining us now from Rabat in Morocco. Noufal, thanks for your time today. Noufal, tell us, what are your thoughts about President Trump's pledge to get out of Syria, in fact, the entire Middle East, really, but then now he wants to protect oil fields. That's sort of a mixed message, isn't it?
Yes, thank you for having me. One of the most important things here is that what is not said is as important or more important what is not said. And what is not said here is that Donald Trump himself, a long time ago, not long ago, said that actually they spent $8 trillion in wars in the Middle East. And despite this money and the spending of money and the loss of life and bloodshed, it did not make the Middle East safer, it did not make the Middle East stable, and it did not make the Middle East more secure than before these conflicts and before the intervention happened. Yeah. What is not said is that actually the intervention made the conflicts in Syria more complex, and getting out from Syria now it will create another complex conflict, another kind of violent extremism and terrorism. And one of the most important things is that when there are hasty interventions, they inform on how the departure of the military would be. There was a hasty military intervention, and there is a hasty departure for the military. So it will be in the unknown now on how these conflicts will develop in the future, and how to address them is more complex than before.
So Taleb, you said earlier, Taleb, about the fact that it's welcome news, of course, with the US president saying he doesn't want to continually be involved in wars in the Middle East or interventions in the Middle East. But I wonder, Taleb, if you think it's realistic for the US to walk away, especially considering the US seems so involved in so many places in the Middle East even. Is it practical for us to imagine a day where the US will not be involved in the Middle East?
Yes, I think yes, because Middle East is a place of the world which is full of problems and full of many other things which are not consistent with American policy. This is first, and second, I think now we are witnessing a kind of international redeployment of American forces from Middle East to the north of Pacific around China, because if you look at the estimates of national security of American national security institutes, they believe that China is the greatest threat to the American hegemony all over the world, and they spend a long time in Middle East and spend great amounts of money, so they must leave this area. And now Russia is the only one policeman of the Middle East, and so United States will deliver all this region to Russia. And I don't think now Middle East is so important and valuable in American strategy if you will compare it with China or with the eastern of Asia, with the Indian Ocean, with other regions of the world. And we witness a great change in American policy. President Donald Trump said he is against globalization, and he is from patriotism in his speech in front of United Nations. So he will take care about internal issues of United States, and he should not be involved in any war in the world if this war is not so necessary for American national security. Or I think he will compare between privilege and between economic outcome of any war instead of looking for ideology, democracy, or freedom, or so on.
Okay, we're just going to go into a short break now. I'm going to ask Taleb, Joseph, and Noufal to stay with us. Of course, we're going to continue this conversation after that break, viewers. Stay with us. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're continuing to discuss Syria, of course. Let me go to Joseph now. Joseph, you've heard from our other guests there. And, I'm looking at this from an entire Middle East point of view, because obviously we can't just disregard U.S. involvement elsewhere in the Middle East and its influence elsewhere also. Do you think that Donald Trump really will be able to help the U.S. take a step back from the region? Will that, A, be a good thing for U.S. national interests, firstly, and B, will that even be good for the Middle East's own interests, where the region's own players then get to resolve their own issues, seemingly?
Well, I mean, his decision to move back to retreat somewhat from the Middle East is really the pledge he gave to the American electorate, those 46 million people who voted for him in 2016. So in a sense, he's trying to fulfill that pledge. At the same time, he can't retreat entirely. I mean, people watch how the leading nations in the world behave. Everyone was watching the United States very closely in Iraq, the way people watched the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And sometimes great powers find out that they suffer from this cultural blindness. That is, they don't understand the things that they're engaged in. They don't understand the places they're in. I mean, the idea of saying you're going to take troops out of Syria and then you're going to send thousands of troops more to Saudi Arabia doesn't make any sense to anybody, because those are the original complaints from the 9/11 terrorists, that there was Americans on Saudi soil. So in a sense, there's this sort of cultural blindness. But the president's driven by the domestic agenda. He doesn't pretend to know much about the world. He's surrounded by people who do know a lot about the world. But I think everyone pays attention to how the president behaves. I've been to 4 security conferences in Europe in the last 6 months, and they're all very concerned about the lack of leadership from the United States. So the United States does not lead in the Middle East. Can they trust them vis-a-vis Russia and Crimea and eastern Ukraine? There are people who are sort of terrified up in the northern parts of Europe.
If I may push you on that point, though, Joseph, for a moment, and I'm not saying that you're alluding to this, but I mean, do you think that it shouldn't be such that the region's own players lead in this region instead of having any external players, be it Russia, be it anybody else, including the US? Why not just leave the region's countries to deal with their own issues amongst themselves?
I think that's perfectly correct. I mean, I think regional problems have to be solved by regional nations. That's absolutely correct. Great powers, or superpowers in the past, have always been able to work in different kinds of regions, hence one of the perks of being a superpower. I have no problem in the region sorting itself out. Does Russia belong in that neck of the woods? Probably not. Iran will have a role, and Syria will have a role. Just, a couple months ago, 6 months ago, Syria didn't look like it was going to last, and it's got its territorial integrity back. It's got the United States technically out of the place. It's got everybody under control. Assad, who was looking at war crimes, is becoming legitimate again. So in a way, the powers, great, middle and small, are sort of acting with impunity in that part of the world. And so that's kind of the breakdown of law and order. It's a very bad signal. And I'm not going to say there's any answer to this. But, when I was a kid growing up in Chicago, it was mightily thought by Chicagoans that people in the Middle East should be able to solve their own problems. You don't need Americans or, before that, British troops or Russian troops to solve regional problems. And sometimes I think the difference today is television. In the last 25, 30 years, when we see terrible things happening overseas, it's on the television screen. Yeah. And you can't tell your electorate, I don't want to do anything about chemical weapons or bombs or barrels of chlorine dropped on people. You have to do something. And so we don't always know what to do.
Indeed. Let me go to Noufal with that, because Noufal, it's important, isn't it? I mean, for this region's issues to be resolved by the region's own main players, be it Saudi Arabia, be it Iran, be it the UAE, or any others that we can name. I mean, I imagine that's always the preferred route, instead of having the US come in, or quote unquote international coalitions come in, be it under a UN mandate or otherwise.
Yeah, I would like to comment on that with two points. One, is the US really planning to get out of the region? I don't think so, because even with the plan of troops withdrawing from Syria, now in the first half of 1,000 soldiers and then to 2,000 soldiers, the Pentagon announced that they will redeploy and they will have additional troops in Saudi Arabia after the attack on the Saudi oil facilities. That's the point. The other point is that even the Pentagon also announced that for the plan to withdraw the troops from Syria, it does not mean that they're going to go back home, but they will be repositioned in Western Iraq. And that's the game plan as the Pentagon announced. Do we think that the region will be able to take care of its own problem after the intervention, the military intervention in various countries? I don't think so, because first of all, there is a big no from the civilians in different places in the region, especially in Syria, that says, well, no, you don't leave us like this. You need to protect us and you need to defend us. Most of these civilians are those who could not actually leave the country. Most of them are women and children and elderly and people with disabilities. Would the international community would take responsibility for this? Yes, it should not be only the responsibility of the region. The international law on protections and use of force has its own regulations, and the main spirit of it was actually to protect civilians from wars, from conflict, from violence, from death. This is exactly the opposite of what we are witnessing.
All right, so then, Noufal, if for example, I mean, and we've seen some forms of communication, even between those who do not agree a lot in this region. I mean, a while back, we had, even at the height of the Persian Gulf oil tanker situation, as you well know, a meeting between an Iranian official and an Emirati official, and they were able to come to some sort of an understanding of sorts, even though nothing was signed from what I've understood. And then there's been outreach seemingly on both sides of the Saudis and the Iranians as well to reach out to each other. I mean, I'm just bringing up those examples again, just for the sake of this goal that the region's players can still very much communicate amongst each other and possibly work out their differences, however tough that may be. I mean, what are your thoughts on that specifically?
Yeah. I think that there are two kinds of communications right here in the region. There is a communication at the state level. There is that signals a lot of fear regarding the political stability and power stability in many countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And there is another communication from the people who go out in the streets and asking for an everyday peace, an everyday human rights, and everyday justice. So yes, there will be some talks behind the scenes at the state power to preserve that power among them. But it is very much threatened by the basis of people coming out in the streets in different countries in the region. These people are actually asking for something completely different than security from a strict sense of it. They want an everyday peace, an everyday dignity, and an everyday justice. And I don't think all these conversations at the top level regarding oil, regarding the power stability in this country will be sustained for a long time without the inclusion of people.
All right, so Taleb, let me look at you for a moment, because I think one of the important things is to come back to Syria, if I may, for a moment, Taleb. Your thoughts specifically on where you're sitting in Damascus and what the view is there now on where the situation in Syria will head in the coming days, months, or even years, really, vis-a-vis Syria's own sovereignty, its own borders, etc.
Yes, the situation in Syria now is much more better than any situation had ever happened in the past 8 years. And now Syrian government could regain its authority in the major parts of Syria. And now there's a real cooperation between Syrian army and between the Kurdish troops who are fighting against Turks. I think by the end of the day, Syrian government will be able to control all of its borders and will unify the country again. The situation which has emerged in the past years, it is not legal and it is not acceptable, not only by Syrian government, but all the neighboring countries, which felt that a great threat to their national security, especially Turkey, Iraq, and Lebanon.
I wonder, Joseph, what your thoughts are when it comes to Syria and this involvement and the way things have worked out right now. Many people are happy about the way this deal has been reached between Russia and Turkey and their understanding on what's to happen in the safe zone in Syria. But at the same time, then, the Syrian government will obviously argue, as you well know, Joseph, that they must be the ones with sovereignty over their own territory, certainly. Will that occur at some point in time, taking, of course, into consideration Turkey's border security concerns?
Yeah, I think it will. I think it will predominate for this reason. There are about 194 nations in the world. They're all supreme. There's nothing beyond the nation state, and Syria has been able to pull itself back together under the nation state. The sovereignty will be run by one government, probably with a little bit of sharing, and so Syria is not going to disappear. And the people who rose up against various injustices or perceived injustices in Syria, they thought that maybe they could import American-style democracy in these places. And, you know, the really sad secret of the 20th century is American democracy cannot be exported. It doesn't travel well. And it doesn't fit in a lot of places. And so the gentleman who's talking from Damascus is quite right. If it works, if people are satisfied, if they're happy, if they can go about their business, and, you know, and if they can put up a little bit of political interference, maybe that's all people are going to get right now. But the whole world doesn't look the same. And so you have to put up with, I think, various different tolerances. But, my fear is that there have been so much bloodshed in these places. And what is it? Millions of Syrians have been displaced. Millions are living in tents in Jordan and in Turkey. I mean, are these people ever coming home? Does anyone want to see them again? What about their property? I mean, is this going to go on forever? In other words, Syria has monumental problems to solve in order to survive over the next 10 or 20 years. And it's going to have to deal with those. And so my conclusion is that places like Syria today, we should substitute great power intervention with multilateral solutions. That is to bring in the international community whenever we can, however we can, to solve a lot of these post-conflict resolutions or post-conflict problems.
Very well. We'll leave that as a final word, but of course, all three of our guests for their time and of course their insight today. That was Joseph speaking to us from Melbourne, Taleb was speaking to us from the Syrian capital Damascus, as well as Noufal, who was speaking to us from Rabat in Morocco. Now, viewers, this was an important topic to talk about because, Trump's claim about getting out of Syria is being proven wrong in some ways on the ground when the Pentagon now seeks to have troops to protect, quote unquote, oil fields in Syria. And then on top of that, we have this NATO chief who's supporting the German defense minister's idea for an international safe zone in Syria. I mean, is it good to have even more players now come in back into Syria and to play roles there? We thought we were heading towards a place where Syria was regaining its sovereignty overall, that this was possibly now the end game in Syria, but are we going back to square one in some ways with even more international involvement in that country? What does that mean for the Syrian civilians as well who have been suffering this entire time? We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Iran's economy. And obviously, as we well know, ever since the United States walked away from the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, that had been signed, not, of course, just between the U.S. and Iran, but other signatories as well, such as the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese as well, that Iran's economy has come under sanctions once again, very tough sanctions, especially under Donald Trump, who has initiated a policy of maximum pressure on Iran to make it bow essentially to U.S. demands, be it for its regional policies or otherwise. Now, some of the statistics that are coming out from the IMF, from the World Bank, are worrying when it comes to inflation, when it comes to the rise of basic things like, food and other items, as well as, inflation overall and just rents going up drastically in the country. And of course, then there is domestic criticism, as we well know, within Iran as well, of President Hassan Rouhani and him not really having a plan B if this nuclear deal were to fall apart, seemingly at least on the outside. Let's put that to our guests and discuss this a bit further. We're joined now by Sirous, who is a tutor and guest lecturer at the Center for Defense and Security Studies at Massey University. He's joining us now from Palmerston North in New Zealand. We're also joined by Tohid Asadi, who is a researcher at the Department of Political Science at the University of Zurich. He specializes in U.S. foreign politics and economics, and he's joining us now from Zurich. Tohid and Sirous, thank you both for your time today. Tohid, I'd like to start with you. How concerned are you about Iran's economy? Can it really recover? I mean, just recently we had Rouhani who said, everything is going to be just fine. But, obviously we would expect the Iranian president to say that, to be positive. But people are suffering, aren't they?
Well, frankly speaking, there is no small spot of hesitation that the economic situation in Iran is far from the ideal situation that could be expected. Part of this could be associated with the maximum pressure that is implemented by the United States, and then it could be partly attributed to the domestic factors that takes place within the country. So with that said, I think we should pay close attention to the very huge amount of difference that's between what is covered in the dominant discourse of Western media pertaining to Iran and what exists on the ground. I can tell you that it is not that bad that it is portrayed in actually the Western media and in reports that are published by Western-oriented institutes. I'm coming from Iran just 3-4 weeks ago. I was there, and then I have lived there, and I have seen that all these situations that are described basically by the West is not that much of the case. But at all events, we need to pay again close attention to the causes behind this situation. We know that Iran just fulfilled all the obligations that it was supposed to, and then it showed all the goodwill that it could through going for negotiations with the West for so many years, and the result of which you're pretty much aware was JCPOA of 2015, but we saw that the Western signatories of this, let's say, agreement were not that much reliable when it comes to the United States. We saw unilateral withdrawal with all.
Okay, so on that point, the Tohid, I want to put that to Sirous. Sirous, I imagine that Iranian officials, or at least the Rouhani government, should have been prepared, shouldn't have, to not really go into such a deal completely trusting the other side, right? Or the other signatories to be able to just live up to all of their, conditions in this agreement. Because, Iran has experience with this ever since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. So why would the Rouhani administration seemingly, again, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, go into this so blind that the economy has reached the point where it has now, where, even the Atlantic Council is not talking about the fact that the inflation is so high now that it's actually stagflation, which simply means stagnation plus inflation. And obviously that doesn't bode very well going into 2020.
One point we should consider is that beggars are not choosers. Iran at that point did not have any other option than to negotiate with the United States and wish for the best to happen. No one could have told the future. But the point I'm saying is that Iran did not have any other options. That time were very hard, Iran was finding it very difficult to balance the budget, to pay the subsidies, to keep the price of petrol, and to trade its oil and sell it. And essentially, it went for the best. I personally expected better things to happen, but unfortunately it hasn't. But there is a criticism that it's valid that Iran and Rouhani administration don't seem to have a plan B, and or just sitting with their hands up in the air, just waiting for the future to see what's going to happen, which I think is really bad, and it shouldn't be like this.
Indeed, and one of the things, Sirous, that's come out is, the numbers that we're looking at right now vis-a-vis Iran's economy are the worst since 1984. What does that mean then for the upcoming years then, do you think? Do you think that, as I said before, Iranians have been living under this sort of pressure ever since really the Islamic Revolution of 1979, but do you think that they will figure out a way from this?
Well, right now in Iran, there's discussion about how next year's budget's going to look. And they're planning to remove the share of oil income and put it down to zero and try to, balance the budget using other means. And to be able to achieve that, Iran has to put very immense pressure on people. Now, I know Mr. Asadi and his friends sitting in the upper parts of Tehran might not have felt it, but in order for that to happen, the price of petrol has to go down. 30% of people have to stop receiving government subsidies, or what we call yarane, and that's like the cash handouts people are getting. There has to be, other changes in the price of energy. There has to be a tax increase for the government to be able to make a budget without the oil income. Now, in last year, the percentage of oil income in the budget was 25%. Now imagine losing 25% of your income and having to balance it and make a budget without that 25%. It's going to be difficult, and I'm pretty sure much of it is going to be felt by the people on the ground.
All right, so Tohid, I want to give you a chance to respond to that, because oil dependency and an oil-dependent economy, moving away from dependency on oil, I should put it that way, that's very tough for any country anywhere in the world. But in Iran, it's being called for by the likes of Ayatollah Khamenei for many, many years, who has said, listen, let's move away from oil, let's move away from oil. Can that finally happen?
Well, there are a couple of points that I need to respond. I don't want to take it personal, but first of all, I'm not living in upper parts of this Tehran. I live in very ordinary neighborhood, which is not that much related to this conversation. But since our friend Sirous mentioned that, I had to respond it. And then getting back to the very content of what he said, I think there is a huge amount of controversy pertaining to the points that he raised. First of all, he said that Iran had no options. Of course, Iran had so many options on the table, but just for the sake of showing goodwill, it just tried to show the world that it is the country of negotiation. It is the country of talk, and they started this negotiation. So why don't you take a look at least for the reason behind the failure of JCPOA? And then he's talking about the huge amount of decrease in oil export of Iran. Then again, my question is that why don't you take a look at the reason behind?
But then Tohid, I mean, I imagine the argument, and just for argument's sake, help you. I mean, you have to take into account as the government, as the president of the country, and I'm talking about Hassan Rouhani, for example, you have to take into account that your job is to protect your own people, right? So, I mean, sure, I mean, I completely understand your point about negotiations and showing that Iran stands by deals. All of that, of course, credit to Iran and Iran's government and Iranian officials, but the people have suffered in this. As I said, the economy is doing the worst in 2019 since 1984. That's not a good thing. That's Rouhani's fault in some ways, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. Well, I think the kind of duality and, let's say, bipolar approach that you have taken towards Iran is not, with all due respect, correct, because you cannot separate from people, and you cannot separate government from people. Actually, the government is elected by votes of people, and then they are not that much different. And then Iranian people have this very understanding that a lot of problems economically speaking exist, but the reason is not Rouhani, the reason is not the policies taken by Iranian officials. They can pretty much understand the very fact that a lot of this pressure comes from outside, and this is because of just the hostility and the rancorous nature of approach that the United States, in addition to its Western partners, are taking towards Iran. So I think Iranian people have got a very clear picture of actually the reason behind these complexities and these problems, and that is the point that we need to pay attention.
Sure. So Sirous, tell us, what options do you think Iran has then going forward to be able to recover the losses that have now been incurred ever since the US walked away from the nuclear deal?
Just a PS before I actually go to that point. I mean, if you search my name on the Atlantic Council, you can find many pieces I've written that I've criticized the US for reneging on the deal it made and on its word. So I'm not putting the blame, removing the blame off the US. So at that point. Now, your question. So what options Iran has? I think one of the things we've been witnessing is Iran has been trying to form a rapprochement bond with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We've been hearing about Prince Tahnoun bin Zayed, MBZ's brother, coming to Iran, the UAE releasing some of Iran assets. I think what Iran has to do is to try to mend its relationship with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, because those two seem to be the main actors that are putting wood in this fire alongside Israel. Now, Iran's issue with Israel cannot be solved in the short term, but maybe with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, that could be possible. So if for the first step, I would suggest to sit down, talk with the Arabs, and, try to at least get them to stop putting so much fire in this wood and, pumping Donald Trump up, and then, just see what's going to happen after that.
Tohid, what are your thoughts on that? Because, certainly credit to Iran for reaching out to the Saudis and the Emiratis, and the Iranians have always seemingly wanted to have these regional discussions. Is that a good first step?
Well, I think Iranian foreign policy has been at least at regional level, has been based upon the friendship. And this is why Foreign Minister Zarif just recently published an article and then just put emphasis on this very fact that regional problems should be solved in a regional manner. And just following what you said, Iran has taken a various number of initiatives to establish a better relation with its Arab region, let's say neighbors in the region. So this is the very gist of the argument from Iranian side. But when it comes to the other side, actually, I think Arabs, at least when it comes to Saudi Arabia, are far from a realistic understanding of what takes place in the region. This is something which needs critical attention, at least from the perspective of our Arab brothers. The point is that if we have a situation in which the United States stops interference, and in a situation that, let's say, Arab neighbors would come to this understanding that regional problems couldn't be solved with this kind of interfering approach by the United States, then the doors would actually open for any kind of probable negotiation, probable cooperation. Okay. And this is a very important point, because imagine a situation in which Iran and Arabs could have kind of alliance or partnership, then the power which would result would be unbelievably strong. And this is not, I think, something the United States would like it. And that's why they start to do anything possible in order for the region to be more and more complex.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but of course, appreciate both Tohid and Sirous for their time today, and of course, for their arguments, both sides. We try to give you, of course, a balanced view on these sorts of things here in Scope. And of course, viewers, Iran's economy, as I said, is suffering. There's no doubt about that, and both of our guests agree on that. But of course, the causes we can disagree on. Certainly, no one is denying that the U.S. sanctions have a huge role to play in why the economy may be suffering. But there is, and there should be, some blame also shouldered by the Iranian government, the sitting Iranian government, I should say, who should have had a plan in place. That doesn't mean that things can be corrected overnight or completely resolved, but certainly there should be something in place to be able to resolve such economic hardship being faced by the people themselves. And then, of course, steps that Iran needs to take going forward. It seems that everybody in the region does want to get along. There has been these conversations and these outreaches on both sides. And of course, there's blame to go around and differences on both sides and, disagreements about regional policies, but all that can be resolved if one is sitting down at a negotiating table instead of battling it out, and instead of, as Tohid there said, had an external player involved, such as the United States. Regional issues should be resolved by regional countries together, working together. We'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks very much for watching.